Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. Today, with continuing counter-programming to the wacky Japanese game show that is American politics, we have a very exciting guest. We have Sophia Rosenfeld, who's the Walter Annenberg Professor of History and former chair of the Department of History at the University of Pennsylvania, where she teaches European and American intellectual and cultural history, with a special emphasis on the Enlightenment, which is so hot right now. And her latest book is The Age of Choice, A History of Freedom in Modern Life. Sophia, welcome to The Remnant.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
As you were warned and as listeners expect, first question out of the box is, what's your book about?
Okay, so the book's about something that pretty much everybody we know does pretty much every day, and that's picking things off of menus, of options. So every time you pick a coffee at Starbucks, or you select an entertainment for the evening, or go on a dating app, or pick a political candidate for that matter, you're engaging in this thing that we call choice, deciding what meets your preferences and acting on it in some way. And we do it so much that it's not something we talk about a lot because it's such a common feature of everyday life. And I became curious some while ago, how did doing this thing become what we mean generally by freedom these days, as if freedom of choice was freedom in full? And so the book is really about, in a nutshell, how did this happen? What causes and what practices made this all happen? And it's also about what have we gained and lost? What have been the advantages of thinking about freedom as a matter of picking things off menus? And what have been some of the downsides? So that's really it in a nutshell.
Okay, so I will confess, I get berated about this from time to time from listeners, but I have not finished the book yet. I started doing my homework on this, and I was like, I got to get this book. So I went and got the Kindle and started reading it. And because it's in my wheelhouse in a bunch of different ways. And one of the themes on this podcast in particular that I return to a lot when we do intellectual history is, like, I love intellectual history. I think it's really interesting. I think it's important. I think it matters. I don't think it's everything, but I think it matters, right?
Sure.
At the same time, I had this sort of half epiphany a few years ago where I came to the conclusion that intellectual history still matters, but sometimes intellectual history is a lagging indicator rather than a leading indicator. And so you'll have moments in history where ideas are in the groundwater, and all of a sudden someone will come forward with a book or an essay or a lecture or an idea of one kind or another that encapsulates a sentiment that's already sort of fermenting out there. And like one of the examples I'll often use is The Greening of America, which was an absolutely terrible book, but it kind of captured this cult of youth thing in the 1970s. Or even Herbert Crowley's Promise of American Life, which was a really important book. Don't get me wrong. It's a catalytic thing. It becomes a chicken or the egg thing, but there were all these intellectuals who said when they read that book, it articulated what they were already thinking, right? And that's sort of what I'm getting at. And one of the things I like about your approach to this is you spend a lot more time on the groundwater part of it than on you have a lot of intellectual history in it, but the intellectuals are dealing with changing ground truths is what I'm getting at.
Right. I think that's absolutely the case. And actually, I don't think ideas ever really resonate anywhere, anytime, unless they correspond a little bit to things we're already doing.
Yeah.
If you throw out a really wacky idea and it doesn't correspond to any daily life practices, most people would sort of shrug and say, that sounds insane. Whereas when ideas can kind of pick up what people are already doing. So my example is John Stuart Mill, for instance. His conceptions of liberty as finding your own path can only have made sense in the middle of Victorian England when people were actually doing some of these things. So I'm interested in some ways in which intellectuals, I think you're right, are sometimes kind of late to the game, even as they end up shaping how we see things. And as a historian myself, I'm interested in a particular kind of idea that may strike some people as a little odd, but I'm interested in basically the taken for granted, the things we don't notice that we tend to already think. So an idea like choice is freedom is not a idea that's specifically right wing or left wing. It doesn't belong to this subset of people and not that subset. It's something that most of us assume to be the case.
Right.
There are critics, but there are few and far between. And why is that? Because it's kind of how we live. And so I'm always interested in exploring those ideas that I think have a history, but that don't seem like they have a history because they're so ubiquitous and so ordinary.
Yeah, it's sort of like, I mean, again, it's on the bingo card for this podcast, but a lot of intellectuals, friends of mine, love to argue with these ideas that escaped some lab in France or, Germany, then mutated in France and came over here. That's fine. I like those arguments, right? It's fun to argue with Nietzsche. But uh, if you're looking at what changed social mores and behaviors in America at the beginning of the 20th century, you could take all of those intellectuals and combine them and multiply it by 10, and it doesn't equal what the automobile did, or in the 1970s, what the birth control bill did. I mean, the technology drives a lot more cultural change but you can't argue with the Buick. You can argue with, Sartre. And so there's a lot of that going on.
Yeah, I think that intellectuals and discourse in general, newspapers, for instance, change the way we talk about things and the way we think about them, but they might not change what we do precisely. So I think you're absolutely right. So the Buick comes in and it changes the way people drive around. But then how do you talk about what that means? How did the road become equated to, the open road and freedom, say?
Right.
That has to be a sort of second layer on top of the experience. So the experience shapes the way we talk about things, but then the way we talk about things shapes the experience too.
Well,
And
also just the explosion of out of wedlock births that comes with the, from the front porch to the back seat transition in American life was just a huge thing, but it wasn't about
right.
an idea, right? It was about an ability.
And your birth control example is perfect for that too. I agree entirely that, the feminism doesn't just take off because Betty Friedan writes an important book on the subject. It's people can live differently, women
Right.
especially. And it's the kind of synergy of those two things that really ignites feminism in the late 60s and into the 70s.
Okay, so let's get back to the book now that I've done my own sort of special pleading. Where does this transition to thinking that choice means freedom come from? Like, just the timeline of it.
So there are really two answers to that question. One is that there's a deep history. So you could go all the way back, as I try to do in the book, to 17th, 18th century Europe and the colonies in North America and find roots in two good places. One is in the explosion of trade and commerce overseas, particularly things like Indian cloth penetrating all over the Atlantic. And when people could finally do something that we recognize still, walk into a shop, see an array of different colors at the same price point and decide, I think I like the blue better than the red checks. That's a kind of moment of choice that sounds obvious. And it's not like people never bought anything before, but this whole idea of selecting what you like becomes both a promotion technique and an advertising one, starting in really the 18th century. And even the word shopping dates from that period. So that's one side. And the other side comes deeply out of the Reformation, the fracturing of Christianity across Europe even earlier. It isn't intended to create multiple options for religion the same way shopping is, but the net effect is a fracturing of Christianity into different sects and a growing sense of freedom of conscience as an idea,
Right.
meaning I, in some sense, have to see what I respond to, what minister, what church, what denomination, what set of practices is meaningful for me, my
Right.
preferences in some way. So they're not identical, but I think they're the kind of dual roots of this modern obsession with choice. That said, nobody talks about choice in the 17th or 18th century the way we do today. And it's really only in the 20th century, I think, and close to the Second World War that we get to this place where capitalism and democracy are celebrated in much the same way. The Second World War is full of promotions that say, only now are you able to buy what you want, be what you want, vote for who you want. And becomes in contrast to fascism or communism, becomes a kind of calling card of a certain kind of society with the US in the front. And that's a pretty late development, which makes our current notions of freedom actually not something that runs through hundreds and hundreds of years of Western history.
Yeah, it's funny. I was thinking about Jerry Mueller and his history of market, his economic history. He has this chapter where he talks about Eustace Moser, who was a 18th century German jurist, philosopher, like lawyer kind of guy, in some, I want to say Wallachia, one of these little, German principalities. And he has this stuff about how much he hates traveling salesmen.
Hmm.
And this is in part where, anti-Semitism goes back further than this, but part of, like, there are all these German words, that whole idea of "don't Jew me out of this," that anti-Semitic trope. There's it comes from this period of itinerant, traveling salesmen, peripatetic, with their little wagons, going to these little villages and selling their wares. And Moser decries this by saying, this is so unsettling. This is bringing unneeded luxuries to people, and it's overturning the apple cart of the established order, and the guilds can't compete with these things, and people should just be happy with what's been available for hundreds of years, and all this kind of stuff. And then you actually, as Mueller points out, you actually look at what these guys were selling, and it was like thimbles, so that you could actually sew without making Swiss cheese out of your finger, and little covers for your cast iron skillet so you don't burn yourself when you're, and there's these little things that were improving people's lives. But the ability to give people choice and actually create a kind of, there was some income inequality stuff implied in it. There was also like screwing with the cartel thing, but that sort of choice created a significant anti-Semitic backlash. That was one of the things that associated usury was another, but associated capitalism with Judaism. And so it comes to mind just because the idea of introducing choice used to be really threatening to the powers that be.
That's right. That's absolutely the case. And it's interesting that you bring up Jews in this because, of course, Jews didn't have the option that Christians did in most places of owning land and working the land. So commerce and money lending, for instance, were the only employments available. So yes, Jews were prominent even in the early days in this country among itinerant salesmen, and they traveled around with books and cloth, and as you say, thimbles too, everything, tin cans, any amount of material. And then anti-Semitism, as it accelerates in the 19th century, is often attached to the idea that it's also Jews who are behind the new department stores where everything is on offer. So the big German department stores are primarily owned by Jews, and they're an easy target in this sense. And part of the critique is ordinary people are suddenly going to have the kind of choices that were once available only to elites of various kinds. So even if it's picking between two different ribbons, it's still a kind of selection. It's non-essential goods. So choosing has become this idea, not, if you go to a market and you say, I need a chicken, and a chicken is supplied to you, you haven't really made a choice. But if you go to a market and it's full of different ribbons of different colors, and there's 5 different options of what you can have for dinner at different price points, then you're doing something quite different than just provisioning yourself or your family. And that's the activity that was found as you say, for a long time to be sort of titillating and exciting, but also very threatening. And it threatened social hierarchies. It threatened to lead people into wanting more. And it's, to us, absolutely ordinary at this point. We don't imagine anyone. We think even the poor we tend to assume have some range of choice, but this is a very modern development.
So it's funny, like, I'm grateful to you because when I was doing my homework for this, you kind of partially solved this thing that has been bothering me for a very long time, which is if you read about the 17th century, 16th, 17th into 18th century um, aristocrats and nobles in particularly France, but also in places like England, they use the word liberty to be something closer to privilege or entitlement. And it seems to me that choice this point about choice is that, being at liberty, right? Which is this sort of thing in the language that you have the ability to make your own decisions about something that the little people don't get to make these sorts of decisions. And anyway, this idea of choice, of being able to satisfy your personal aesthetic desires or tastes or whatever, was associated with aristocracy and nobility, and it helps me understand why they consider entitlements and grants and privileges to be a kind of freedom and how that etymology might evolve there. Does that make sense?
It does. It's interesting. There's a small nuance in all of this, which is that earlier notions of freedom, sometimes they meant, if you're thinking something like spiritual freedom, meant giving up various kinds of choices to live in
Hmm.
accord with some rules that you freely adopt. So that's a very different notion of freedom for sure. So, for instance, if you can freely decide to become a nun or a monk, and you give up a lot, but you've done it of your own volition. But the more ordinary use of liberty or freedom that you're referring to has to do with not being dominated by anybody else. So no,
Hmm.
basically, nobody else can tell you what to do. So an enslaved person is the height of unfreedom. A person who isn't beholden to someone else, isn't their serf, isn't their servant, is a free person. Whether though they chose things off menus of options in full is they probably did. That was one of
Yeah.
their liberties, but it wasn't sort of defining of
Yeah.
liberty
Yeah. Yeah. I
unto
can see that.
itself. It had more to do with your standing. Now we think the reason that freedom of choice is freedom is because it gives you two things. It gives you what you want. So, like, I go into the store, I know what I prefer, and I get it. And also because it kind of gives you autonomy, dignity as a person. Human rights is all defined these days about the right to make your own choices. And that means to be a full person, an
Hmm.
adult person at least. And so we kind of give choice these two different reasons for being important to us.
All right. So let's get back to the, the politics for a second.
Sure.
Um, I was trying to think this through, and I think this is a little forced and it's not really sustainable linguistically. But I think there's something there, that there's a difference between choices and decisions. Insofar as decision kind of implies an amount of deliberation. You're taking a certain amount of ownership of the consequences of your decision. I mean, again, I'm imposing some stuff here for the sake of making a distinction because they're two different kinds of things, right? Meanwhile, choice
Yes.
choice is kind of like, I'm going to choose vanilla ice cream today, right? There's much less sort of moral socio-political import that we impose on the concept of choice. It is just one's personal preferences. Now, that doesn't mean, like in the case of abortion, it doesn't scale up into something much more important. But democracy begins as our small r republicanism, right? With elections, begins with this idea that voting is about deliberation and decision making. And at some point it flips to this thing about choices for everybody. Like, talk me through like the secret ballot
Yeah.
stuff and how that evolves.
Yeah. You're touching on something really important here, I think. And I agree that choice and decision are not identical. So, choice really does suggest there's kind of a menu and it's personal, and you decide what's best for you. Now, that might imply your values, your preferences, your aesthetics, your interests, but it's really a personal choice of some kind. So, and even within that realm, sure, we don't choose everything in the same way. We don't choose a spouse the same way we choose a toaster oven. We
Right.
give one a lot more thought, I hope, than the other. So there's even a range of different kinds of choices we make. But politics is complicated in all this because early on you can find, even say, the time of the Constitution, there's a lot of discussion about giving people choice in politics, which means small r republicanism, elections. But, and here's the big but in all of this, but elections are imagined in the 18th and into the 19th century really differently than they are today. And that's true whether we're talking about the new United States or around most of the globe. The secret ballot is a late development, and it's an important one, I think, because in the US at least, the secret ballot is not used uniformly until the 1890s. It's really a late turn in things. And why does this matter? It's a really different way of practicing elections. Early elections, it was thought that loosely the people, which really only meant those who had the vote, would decide collectively, largely, on behalf of the public good. That there would be, and that's more like a collective decision. And even the way people voted, sometimes people just put their hands in the air, or they all walked to one side of the room if they were in favor of this rather than the other. It wasn't necessarily private. It wasn't necessarily one person, one vote in the same way we imagine. And most people voted on behalf of other people. So heads of households, property owners, voted on behalf of their wives, their servants, their children, any dependents, employees.
They counted the actual votes, so one person had like 12 votes because of the size of their house.
No.
Okay.
People get there, but often voting, then it wasn't always a very quantitative process in the sense that people were voters and non-voters were mixed in together in the space. And there was often just a sort of general sense most people are for this solution. We do this very, very precise, individualized voting and then aggregating afterwards that suggests instead of me coming in and representing loosely a group of people or the public interest and deciding what's in everyone's interest, I go in and I decide what I want. Who do I like? It's almost like which team are you rooting for, right? And I don't have to vote on any particular criteria. I don't have to share what I'm doing with anyone else. I don't have to tell anyone. In fact, most of the time I don't. And at the end, it's aggregated. It's a math problem. Did more people go for team A or team B? And it suggests voting eventually falling into line with things like shopping, with more on this sort of personal choice mode. But it's not evident that this is really how voting was imagined in the aftermath, say, of the American Revolution. Certainly not how voting was imagined in the English tradition either.
Yeah, so I'm struggling with this because one of my, if you gave me 3 wishes that didn't involve asking for more wishes or more Powerball numbers, it would be to restore a healthy understanding of I'm in favor of democracy. I'm certainly in favor of competitive elections and that kind of thing. But I think the way we talk about democracy obscures the way we used to understand republicanism, which was sort of, which is a big debate, what it means, what doesn't mean, and all that kind of stuff. But it certainly means that at least implies that you had community leaders who were imbued with a sense of civic virtue and a responsibility to what is best for everybody kind of thing. And one of the things that I think with the atrophying of a robust sense of what small r republicanism means is we start throwing on democracy crap burdens it can't carry as a concept. I'm increasingly of the mind that I wish we could just, when we talk about democracy, talk about free and fair and competitive elections, and don't do the John Dewey shtick. Don't bring all these other things in about, the spirit of democracy or social justice or whatever. Democracy is just, it's a system of, it's a hedge against bad outcomes because you have the ability to fire people. And that's good enough. I like that, right? And so one of the things
Yeah, me too.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that drives me crazy is I think one of the things that happens with democracy, the way with this personal, reducing it to this personal choice thing, is people don't reduce it to a mathematical thing. They instead, they're even more likely to leap to sort of general will arguments, talking about the spirit of the people. This is like from Andrew Jackson to Donald Trump, you get and Woodrow Wilson in the middle, smuggling in these concepts of mandates that allow them to do as if, because the president's the only person who's been elected by everybody, that there's some sort of Volksgemeinschaft superpower that emerges that lets them do things that aren't in the Constitution. And anyway, I think that the reducing, I think it's probably for the best that we reduced elections to personal choices, right? I believe in one man, one vote and all that kind of stuff. But in the process, there's something to be said for the stuff you were describing before the 1890s of communities getting together in a sort of Norman Rockwell way and meeting face to face and arguing about stuff and then saying, okay, what do we decide, right? That's kind of gets lost in this switch to atomized individual choice.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's a story of a clear winner or loser in that sense. And I would agree that it's, we've lost something and we've gained something. We've gained the protection of the one person, one vote. We've gained the idea that nobody can tell you your boss can't come out and tell you what you have to stand for. So the autonomy part is all good. But we did lose something in the idea that there even is a collective possibility of what would be in our civic interest, what would be good for us. I think you're right, though, that one of the best thing you can say about democracy in a way is not that the people are so smart, but that you get a chance for a redo.
Right.
And democracy and elections give you a redo every certain number of years, even sometimes between that if there's a recall or something like that. And that's important because it's the ability to sort of see what happens and make a new choice that is really sustaining. So if that was sort of the core of democracy, I wouldn't argue with you that that's sort of what we most want. What goes with it? It's become in some ways our sort of secular religion, but we play it in a really mean way. It's like it's both a moralized setting and it's a winner take all. We've basically lost the ability to compromise. I mean, compromise used to be part of what people imagine democracy is entailing. That isn't how it works right now. I think it's sometimes worth revisiting these older models, not because we want to emulate them directly, but I think it's important to sometimes see that this isn't the only way you can do democracy.
Yeah, I mean, all I was going to say is that the compromise part was a lot easier when you had people of goodwill, responsible people meeting in a room behind closed doors where they could negotiate, right? And part of the problem we have today is we've made everything so transparent, and we made and then the parties have convinced themselves idiotically that they should only care about their base and not actually being majority parties. But if you had more robust institutions where leaders could make decisions, you still need transparency about what their decisions ultimately are. But let them have, like the Constitution wouldn't have been written but for a smoke-filled room. And I just think the loss of some of that communal aspect of how the deliberative aspect of democracy that has been lost in favor of this one of the personal choice thing has diminished the ability to make compromises. It's not the only explanation for it, but just as like it's diminished federalism too, right? It's diminished this idea that the states are sovereign in any way because everyone is going over the heads of their local leaders to vote in nationalized elections.
Right. When you add in also a nationalized media system to all of this, you end up exactly in the position we're in today. That seems absolutely right. You might think of parties in the lingo of today's choice theorists as something like choice architects or choice agents, because they structure what are our options and how are we going to go about this business of deciding. And frankly, they've done a bad job of it, right? They've given us choices that we might not want. They've not really been responsive to the population as a whole, just to their most sort of rabid fans. And it's hard to imagine how politics could work without parties, because you really do need some choice agents to structure the decision-making process. But if you really want to think about electoral reform, you do have to think about the parties as the people who run most of this. It's not really the state these days, it's parties.
Yeah, although, I mean, this is such a common refrain on this podcast. I don't want to like abuse you by dragging you into it, but like, I'm one of these people who thinks the problem with our democracy, a big part of our problem, is that the parties are too weak. Is that they used to be gatekeepers. They used to have a fiduciary interest in protecting their long-term brand. And in the last 10 years, they're just, as my friend Ross Douthat likes to say, they're both parties are sort of two fully fueled jetliners waiting on the tarmac, waiting to be hijacked by demagogues. And
that's a good line.
Yeah, and I think it's largely true. But all right, so I want to steer us in another direction. So I'm of the grand intellectual tradition that really enjoyed making fun of Frankfurt School Marxists until a lot of idiots turned it into a massive conspiracy theory. But they talked a lot about some of the things that you're talking about here, about how excessive choice under capitalism, the abundance of capitalism, turns everything into sort of manufacture, turns luxuries into necessities and manufactures all sorts of felt needs that aren't real. You know, Bernie Sanders, not a Frankfurt School Marxist, but a classic sort of old ward-heeling democratic socialist. He kind of touched on some of this when he said, look, it's crazy. Nobody in this country needs 19 different kinds of deodorant, right? There is a grand sort of charming, antiquated left-wing tradition of really being annoyed by choice or abundance of choice. And obviously there's a right-wing one, but it's different. It has more to do with cultural stuff. But on economics, it's on the left. And like, is that tradition dead? Do you think it's coming back? How much of a role did it play? Did it utterly fail in its argument? And because like a whole big part of your book is we associate choice with freedom now, and it's very difficult for any sort of traditional sort of socialist-minded person to say, we need to take away some of your choices.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, it also has something to do with technology too, right? Which is we've gotten more and more choices in certain domains. Whether it's health insurance plans or toothpaste, you can sit there and read the 12 health plans your employer offers you and try to figure out which one is the one that will correspond to what you need in the future, which you're never going to know ahead of time. You can go read all the toothpaste containers and try to figure out which one it corresponds to your needs. And most of the time we end up concluding probably doesn't make a huge difference for many of these things. They're all kind of variants of the same thing. And that is something that the Frankfurt School kind of warned about, that it would look like we had more and more options. And in fact, most of it just bred conformity of a sort, that we'd be fine with 2 toothpastes instead of 52 of them. So is that really what's happened? In some ways, they got it all wrong, because the number of choices just keeps increasing. I mean, try to watch a movie. You go to Netflix, there are hundreds of options, and we're all kind of going, oh no, what am I going to do? I can't bear to sort through these. On the other hand, since the people who give us all this technology know that we can't actually deal with all of it, algorithmic choice, for instance, has in some ways acted as a personal assistant for most of us at various moments by constantly suggesting to us, you actually want this. And between the people we pay to help us make decisions, financial advisors, travel agents, decorators, whatever it is, and the algorithmic versions of that, or the AI versions, we're also constantly being sold a whittling down, a curated collection of something. If you like this book, you'd like this other one. Here's the advertising that's targeted just for you because we know what your tastes are. So it, it's it's doing both at once, and they got some of this right, and of course they got some of this wrong. I think it really remains to be seen how much we're going to keep feeling that freedom and choice go hand in hand. Because if you're anything like me, you often find sometimes choice is super liberating, but often you find choice is kind of a burden.
Mhm.
Like there are too many options. You go to Amazon, you want to buy something, you don't want 500 toasters to pick from. You get stressed about which one. They all have different features. Your time is being absorbed by doing this. Uh, Sometimes we think the choices aren't good ones, as in political candidates. Sometimes we think we just have too many. But most of us don't feel that we have the perfect set of options all the time from which we mysteriously emerge the people we want to be every time we make that decision.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of you ever see Moscow on the Hudson, the Robin Williams movie?
No, I've never seen
All
it.
right. So there's an absolutely wonderful scene. I'm sure it's on YouTube. Where this, Robin Williams is a Soviet emigre, but before they start with him in the Soviet Union, and just has to jump through all these hoops just to find a cup of coffee or a can of ground coffee or something like that, and wait on lines and yada yada yada. And then he comes to the United States and goes to a giant supermarket. And this is a 1984 supermarket,
Mm.
and he was looking at his list. He was going, coffee, coffee, coffee. And he sees it's just a wall of choices of coffee.
Right.
And he basically has a nervous breakdown because of it, because he couldn't imagine that kind of choice. And I think like, there are kinds of scarcity that are kind of good for building your character. And then there are kinds of scarcity that are not, but like, the paralysis of choice is a real thing, I think.
Oh, yeah. Choice
But
overload, as it's
uh,
known.
um, but as a curmudgeonly misanthropic podcast host who has to marshal immense amounts of energy to be sociable with the other humans, I do have to get one of my gripes in here, which is that um, I'm kind of the view that the 19th century or the Romanticism never ended. It just kind of like became so uh, pervasive in the culture, and therefore sort of like viruses, when they're really acute, are deadly, but then over time viruses don't want to kill the hosts, they want to live in the host, and so it kind of gets a little more muted. But we've lived in an age where all my life we have people saying that the highest moral authority is your own gut, right? It's sort of a downstream of Protestantism in a certain way. I could listen to your conscience, but at least conscience is a concept with some rigor to it in the way Martin Luther used it. We now have a society where people just go with your instincts. The only thing you have to be true to is yourself. And I think that's all I don't want to say it's all garbage, but I do not like it as a cultural phenomenon, insofar as, first of all, the example I always use is of good parenting. And there's not a single good parent out there who would say, hey, look, I wouldn't make those decisions, but you have to be true to yourself. You listen to your gut. So you run with those scissors, right? It's just like there are certain things about institutions, small r republicanism, that it's not so much about restraining choice as informing people about their choices with a certain amount of judgment, shame, not coercion, but moral suasion, that kind of thing. And that's why I find a lot of the talk about democracy sometimes really problematic when people talk about, oh, we should just make it all online and we'll do it by our phone, right? And talk about taking the deliberation out of what the little deliberations left in democracy is. Have someone during the rolling credits of Yellowstone reruns say, I'll vote for that guy, and then that kind of thing. And we tend to have this attitude of the collective choices have some sanctity and nobility to them, when in fact I think that choices glibly and unreflectingly made do not have a lot of moral weight to them. And I just don't know how to, like, it's such a difficult thing for me to talk about with normies because they think I'm against democracy. I'm not against democracy. I really like democracy. But um, the way we talk about voting in this country is, it's sort of like, express yourself.
Right.
And I don't want you to express yourself. I want you to think hard about your choices.
Right. I mean, some people talk about this as kind of, we've gone to increasingly to value neutral choice, which means you do you, right? So choice is what you like, but who am I to judge that choice from outside? Value neutral. So, in the sense of, if it's your preference, if it corresponds to your way of thinking, your way of living, whether it's child rearing or picking a sandwich for lunch, it's kind of your issue. And that does give people a lot of autonomy for sure. But there are places in our world in which actually that's the least good way to arrive, probably at a good end, to let everybody just say, how does it seem to you? And then aggregate the results.
Mhm.
Even, for instance, with people, sort of drawing out your analogy here, do you want people to feel that facts or truths are sort of a choice region?
Right.
Right?
Right.
Like, well, it seemed that way to me. It's my truth.
Right.
Well, really, probably not,
Right.
because there are some sort of objective facts out there. And we want people, for instance, to vote based on a shared sense of some kind of um, set of truths. This is where we are right now, and then we can disagree thoroughly about what the best policy would be to make life safer, or to limit dangers, or to increase wealth or increase happiness. Fine, we can disagree about that, but we can't really easily have a democracy in which we disagree about even what exists. When sort of every fact is unemployment up or down, well, we need to have
Right.
kind of agreed upon that before we go further. And as you say, a kind of choice making where it seems to me like labor's in trouble these days, so my hunch is I'm going to do the following, is not a great way to arrive at decisions.
Right.
And it's very hard for us to get out of that right now, because we consume our own media with our own
We do
points
our
of
own
view.
research. Yeah.
We vote, as you say, as absentmindedly often as we do anything else, particularly in the case in which there's kind of online voting. Right now, most places do a weird compromise in which we go to a public space, but then we go in a little booth and pull a curtain so that it's private, but we've done it publicly, and we get an I voted sticker afterwards or something. That was kind of a compromise that happened a very long time ago, more than 100 years now. Whether that will remain the way we vote in this age, probably not.
Um, I just want to circle back to the Marxist kind of thing for just 2 seconds. We started out by talking about how intellectual history is sometimes a lagging indicator, sort of expressing and articulating the zeitgeist at the time and all that kind of stuff. Do you get the evolution of choice as you lay it out without capitalism? I mean, how much of this is just sort of epiphenomenal of just market economies and the increasing efficiency of market economies to monetize individual choice, consumer choice?
Right. I think you could almost put it the other way. Without the possibility of choice, it's hard to imagine capitalism also,
Fair.
right? You need some set of options that's larger than one
Right.
to produce capitalism. So it's a chicken egg problem of a certain kind. But what I think is interesting is that this is a story certainly about capitalism, but it's not a story, and here's where I would depart from Marxist historians, of capitalism alone.
Mhm.
It's also a story about politics, about religion and ideas. And it's also a story about social life, about how people adapt to new circumstances. For instance, the change from arranged marriages to selection of a mate based on what do I like again, what
Right.
appeals to me. So I think if you could tell a story in which capitalism simply mows down everything in its wake and leaves us with this set of values. But I don't think you'd get at why, for instance, democracy has to work the way it does. You could have capitalism with authoritarian governments too, and
Hmm.
it exists in various places in the world today. So I think the story is more complicated than just capitalism. Also, I will say that some practices emerge because of economic systems, like the fact of trade producing more goods in different places. But the meaning that we give to that process can vary a lot. You could have capitalism also without the sort of celebration of choice as the consumer's great privilege.
Hmm.
So I think that's it's an important question to ask. Is everything downstream from capitalism? Yes and no. How's
Yeah.
that for a mixed
Yeah.
answer?
Um, so we should talk about feminism, and as sort of a springboard for one of the just so stories you get about the birth of feminism in the 19 or that wave of feminism of the 1950s and 1960s is part of it was you had this generation of women who were more college educated than ever before, who are more prosperous than ever before, and who have time saving technologies at home that create a lot of leisure time that and like I maybe someone's done it, but I think a fantastic history book would be a history of boredom as a driver of history. There's a lot of people have written bits and pieces about it. I think boredom drives a lot of very positive things, and I think boredom drives a lot of terrible things. Um, but you had a lot of I don't want to say I use overeducated as a historical thing, not as a judgmental thing. But you had a lot of women educated beyond the things that beyond the roles that they were expected to do, and they were like, What the hell is this? I want to do more." And um, I think that kind of feminism, like capitalism gets some credit for it, right? I mean, like, but for if women were left working the loom and churning butter, they wouldn't have gone to college. They wouldn't, like there's some things that capitalism helped generate that a lot of my conservative friends don't want to acknowledge, and a lot of my lefty friends kind of don't want to acknowledge either.
Interesting. Yes, certainly leisure is an invention itself. I
Right,
mean, I don't think people always sort of said, "What are we going to do this evening?" What they had to do this evening is keep alive, you
right,
know,
right.
and the morning too. What you're describing is really exactly what Betty Friedan in The Feminine Mystique says in 1963. She takes a survey of her former college classmates at Smith in the late 50s and finds that they have all the things they need. They're not wanting for anything, but they're essentially their lives are underdeveloped.
Hmm.
They kind of had some kids. The kids went off to high school. What are they doing now? And they have all these labor saving devices, as you say. So she says they spend all their time kind of figuring out which vacuum cleaner is best, or trying to think up whether they should have potatoes with the chicken or rice with the chicken tonight. And they're kind of emotionally unsatisfied, even as they have the right to vote. They've gotten educations. They have many of, not all, but they have many of the rights that their male counterparts, their husbands and brothers have. And I think one of the reasons, though, that she frames this as saying women need more choices, and this is how kind of second wave feminism you're describing is
Hmm.
often articulated as women demand the same choices, is because this rhetoric already exists.
Yeah,
It's
yeah, yeah.
already dominant. Feminists don't invent the idea that choice is going to bring freedom. They rather smartly capitalize on the fact that this has become already a kind of mantra after the Second World War, that choice is what gives you autonomy, and choice is itself a kind of moral good. Now, we could question whether choice is good in and of itself, or it's only good because it gets you things. But feminists took the former position largely, that women just need a wider range of options and they need more opportunities for choice. And they need to be making choices about things that are more important than vacuum cleaners. And so by the time in the 70s, you get to the right to choose, for instance, interestingly, the mainstream feminist organizations like NOW and Planned Parenthood light upon this because they think it's going to be uncontroversial. They
Right.
actually think it's, equality, that's worrisome. Population control, very worrisome. All the other options look kind of difficult, but they sort of say, who's going to be opposed to choice?
Right.
It's just increasing the basket of options. Of course, it doesn't work out that way, but you can see why by the 1970s, feminism really latched on to this language as the one that would seem most mainstream and potentially run across the right-left spectrum.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, like you think about the generation that grew up in the teeth of the Great Depression, straight through World War II. Shocking that these people who have been deprived choices, been on food rations or been in the military, for years, would all of a sudden like choices for stuff to eat. I mean, if you've been eating military rations for 3 years and now you get to choose tonight's pizza night, whatever. I mean, like you can see how choice would sort of emerge from a period of sustained, material deprivation, particularly at a time when our economy was just going to take off because of the larger economic issues. You can see how choice would be this sort of background radiation good thing for everybody, regardless of your politics.
Yeah, you see it, for instance, when GE advertises war bonds in the middle of the war in really mainstream publications like the Farm Journal. They sometimes put a picture of a little boy on a bike at a crossroads. He's sitting there looking out over the horizon and wondering which route to take. And the link and the advertising pattern underneath says something like, we're fighting this war for freedom of choice. Don't you want your boy to be able to decide whether he goes to college or grows soybeans? And don't you want your family to have options of various kinds? And that's why we're fighting this war. And it's a remarkable kind of synthesis of a political position, an advertising gimmick, a patriotic appeal. And what really I think is so fascinating is that you see this reproduced in places you wouldn't think would be necessarily good bedfellows. The same kind of lingo emerges around the Universal Declaration of Human Rights right after the
Yeah.
Second World War. What do people need? They need the right to choose in the following domains: their religion, their political leaders, their spouses, etc. And so feminism is a little later, but it's basically pulling that thread forward
Yeah.
and saying, yeah, we're all with this. We just want women and also to have those choices because some of them aren't available to women, and women need the choice about birth control and abortion because they can't have the other choices without it. And it backfires in a sense because, of course, it's countered pretty quickly with some other responses, including the right to life one, which suggests a kind of remoralization of choice, that everything isn't open to choice in the same way, that some things are higher values. And it's also attacked from the left. And the left sometimes says, what does it mean to give people a choice if they can't afford to activate it, if they don't have any time off from work, if nobody's providing for childcare? What does it mean to say in the abstract, hey, just go out and choose? So there's a kind of a right and a left critique of this, but it was felt to be deeply mainstream in its framing, even as it was, potentially an overturning of tradition.
Yeah, I mean, two things. One, another data point on the language coming out of World War II is, what FDR's second Bill of Rights, State of the Union address in 44, where he talks about necessitous men are not free men, right? And this idea that they need to be provided with a home, a job, healthcare, and all these kinds of things. But secondly, it's funny, I hadn't really thought about it until listening to you talk just now about the backfiring point. Insofar as, earlier when I was saying how, at least in my mind, there's a difference between a decision and a choice, right? And the language of choice by the 1970s and 1980s is like Pepsi, the choice of a new generation, right? It's a very minor expression of personal taste. And the framing of abortion, whichever side you come down on, we're not going to get into all that. But I think every morally serious person thinks it is a bigger decision than choosing between Coke and Pepsi, right? And you hear a lot of later feminists trying to claw back some of the damage that was done by the choice language by saying, this is a painful decision. This is a decision between me and my doctor, right? Which introduces the language of serious deliberation and trade-offs, which is not implied by just simply the word choice.
That's absolutely right. In England, for instance, there's been less controversy about abortion. It's also been framed from the beginning as much more a medical decision.
Yeah.
It was not about how you wanted to live. It was about something that, like any other healthcare decision that you'd make in consultation with your doctor. Yes, I think there's a sense now that the language of choice was largely a failure. You see people, for instance, talking much more about things like reproductive justice today. The language of choice is declining in the conversation. And it opened up again the question of, when is a choice simply a matter of doing what's best for you? And when is a choice more along the lines of the traditional structuring of, say, Hercules' choice, which is to do the right thing or the wrong thing? And we all on different issues see some places where we think this is a personal decision. This is just what appeals to you. You should have the option of picking any of these educational opportunities, say. And then there are other places where people will disagree and say, there's actually a right and a wrong thing here. And choice frames it all like you're picking a toothpaste again. And rather than like you're picking something that has serious consequences for others.
Yeah.
I mean, the appropriation of the expression "my body, my choice" by protesters against vaccination and mask mandates was a really interesting thing in 2020, right around COVID, because it forced everybody to sort of say, are these parallel? Are these the same scenario, or is one about the general good or about other people, or where the stakes of your choice matter for other people, not just for yourself and your family?
This is very minor special pleading in the time we have left. This is just very eggheady special pleading on my part. But first of all, given all your talk about the conflation of freedom and choice and how the optimizing choices was made synonymous with freedom, I was really surprised that you have basically one parenthetical passage about Milton Friedman's Free to Choose.
Yeah.
Which I think for American conservatives of a certain age is the highest expression of this idea that freedom is about choice. I mean, Nozick maybe is a little deeper on it, but like Free to Choose was a big impact on a lot of people. And I was kind of surprised you didn't go more into it.
Yeah. I mean, that's a very good, and I thought about that a lot. I think my point is this. A lot of people today, especially on the left, like to talk about what they call neoliberalism, meaning the sort of moment when personal choice is everything, a kind of almost libertarian moment that emerges in the late 70s and accelerates in the 80s and Reagan and Thatcher years. And I really wanted to show that this is not an invention of the 70s and 80s, that in many ways, the pieces are already in place. And this goes back to that answer about abortion rights. This wasn't a case of abortion rights defenders inventing something. It was a case of them doing what was already very mainstream.
Right. Tapping into popular language.
Is really an important voice in all this for sure. But he's at the end of the story rather than turning us a whole new way. So I really decided that I'd kind of make the 70s the end point, and I would allude to what happened in the 80s and beyond. But the pieces, to my mind, were already there.
That's a great answer. Okay, just for the record, that's a great answer. I withdraw any implied criticism.
No, it's a
Um,
very fair question because there are
and-
lots of things you could say. Where is it in the book? Because in some ways, I'm trying to write the story of modern life. So there's a
yeah,
lot that could be there that isn't there.
yeah. I mean, I think that's sort of getting back to my point about intellectuals. Is I think a lot of historians rely on intellectual history because it's like the drunk looking under the street lamp for his car keys because the light is good. It's like the intellectual history is written down. Someone said these are the ideas that we are talking about now. Most people trying to choose between a Honda and a Ford didn't write down the
Yeah.
mythopoetic factors in going into that decision.
And that's why I'm interested always, not just in the ideas of the people who had access to not just paper and pens, but printing presses. I'm equally interested in the people who went into those shops and bought
Yeah.
things in the early days. I'm interested in people who selected somebody to dance with at a party in the 19th century. I'm interested in people who filled out a survey card in a magazine in 1920. I want to know how people experienced choice and when did it enter their lives and what did they do with it. And I'm interested in the connection between the doing and the talking about. So one without the other doesn't give us the full story. I think it's that intersection between how we live and how we make ideas out of the ways we live that really makes intellectual history so interesting.
All right. I'm going to invoke podcast host privilege and ask you a question, not about the book, but you are free to say, dude, you're blindsiding me here, and we won't put it in if it, whatever.
Okay.
But given your expertise, Age of Revolutions and all of this stuff, right? So one of my absolute favorite essays, or most impactful essays on me, was Irving Kristol's The American Revolution as a Successful Revolution. And I hadn't read it in a long time. I haven't reread it in a long time. And then for the 250th anniversary of the founding, or of 1776, we at the Dispatch we started doing these essays in celebration of it on different things. And I launched it with an essay about the impact of the American Revolution, and I reread Irving's piece. And it's not so much I want you to criticize Irving, but he quotes Hannah Arendt in there about how basically the American Revolution had no impact on Europe, what's really negligible to non-existent impact on Europe. And I think Hannah Arendt's a mixed bag for all sorts of reasons we could do a whole podcast on. But I just think that's factual nonsense.
Right.
And so in anticipation of the 250th, I figured I would ask someone who's actually a professional historian on this stuff. How do you see, you even have, the Hobsbawm long 19th century that sort of cuts the American Revolution out and starts with the French Revolution, which I think is a little unfair. But how do you think about the American Revolution in the context of the Age of Revolutions and also its impact on revolutionaries, 1830, 1848, whatever, early French Revolution? Was it a big deal or was it not a big deal?
I think that's where Arendt really got things wrong. Arendt is a wonderfully interesting thinker, but she was not infallible, and she often had facts that didn't hold water.
Yeah.
So, you have to read her looking for the really interesting insights, but not take her absolutely literally.
Yeah.
And I think, though, she belonged to a tradition that took the American Revolution, oddly, because of American exceptionalism, to be a uniquely American phenomenon with little impact and little origin in the rest of the world. And today, we just don't talk about the American Revolution that much that way. You can't really explain why it happened without thinking about really global patterns in commerce, in funding, in political orders. And certainly you can't talk about it as having had no impact on the rest of the world. It inspired independence movements all over the Western Hemisphere. And it really was absolutely essential to the early framing of the French Revolution. And the French Revolution is generally taken to be the revolution that inspired all the others. But, you had Jefferson and Franklin and Lafayette there helping sort of orchestrate things in the first phases of the French Revolution. And the French revolutionists had all read the constitutions of the different states, for instance. They were particularly important. They knew the Declaration of Independence, the very language they used, declaring rights. They belonged to something of a common culture already. I'm sitting here talking to you from Philadelphia, where there were lots of French members of all the learned societies going the other direction too. And nowadays, people will generally include the Haitian Revolution as having been impacted by the American and French revolutions, but consequently also impacting what happened subsequently in France and in North America. So to celebrate the American Revolution this year as kind of an isolated event without world historical origins or consequences, I think is a little mistaken. Although I will admit that it's a difficult year to celebrate the American Revolution too. I think we're all sort of wondering, is this the moment to sort of say, look how great democracy's worked out? Is it the moment to say, oh dear, democracy was a lot weaker and easier to dismantle than we thought it would be? Your guess is as good as mine, but you'll notice that it's not going to be all tall ships and cheerful bumper stickers like 1976.
Yeah, it's going to be ultimate fighting matches on the White House lawn.
Right.
I agree.
We're in a new moment.
It feels like somebody made a wish on a monkey paw that Donald Trump is the president for the 250th anniversary.
It is an amazing turn of events.
All right, I could do this all day, but thank you so much. I hope you'll come back because I can nerd out on intellectual history all day long.
Your questions are great, so thank you very much.
Thank you for coming, and we'll put your book and all that stuff in the show notes. And
terrific.
There you go. All right, Sophia Rosenfeld has left the studio, and we kept talking for about a good another 20 minutes after we stopped recording about all sorts of things. I think it is a really interesting topic. I think if you told people that choice and the availability of choice was not definitionally inherent to freedom until fairly recently, they would find it very surprising, and she makes a very good case that that's the case. I suspect if we probe deeper, I would give more credit to the abundance of free market policies. Not that she disputed all of it, but I mean, her chicken and the egg point is a good one as well. But anyway, could have gone a lot of different directions. Highly recommend the book for people who are interested in this kind of stuff. And I can't remember. There were some points I had wanted to make when we were talking. One of them was a point about department stores. I think is a really good one. There's this. I think it's in Alan Brinkley's Voices of Protest. I think that's where it is, which is a great book, by the way, on Huey Long and Father Coughlin in the 1930s. But I think it's in there. It might have been someplace else. But people don't really realize how controversial and disruptive the rise of department stores are. It kind of makes some people might remember 20 years ago, there were a lot of big fights about Walmart coming into various communities and putting locals out of business. And that was a sort of mild taste of it. But department stores in the 1920s and 1930s were really huge dislocations of various settled communities, particularly more than people realize in rural areas or semi-rural areas, because the old style general store wasn't just the place where you went to shop, it was also the place where you got credit, particularly if you were a farmer. You could purchase stuff, necessities, against crop sales, at the end of the season or the next year or whatever, and it would just go on your tally, sort of like in Little House. And when the department stores moved in and put those kinds of mom and pop settled general stores out of business, not just in the United States, but in places like Germany, it invited an enormous amount of resentment. Partly was the Jewish thing, um, and if you look at the founding principles for the Nazi Party, it's really kind of founding manifesto. It's really interesting the prominent role that department stores play in them. Um, anyway, go a bunch of different ways in all of this, but uh, it got me thinking about a bunch of things. So, hey, if you could subscribe to the Dispatch, that would be awesome. And you might hear less from me next week because I'm going on a well-deserved vacation. But I am probably going to still do some stuff from the hammock. And other than that, I'll see you next time.